So Foucault studied the construction of subject formations and the functioning of institutions that perpetuate and hold up these forms, and their role in producing the positions and practices of pathologization and normalization via governmentality. So institutions such as the prison, the school, the mental hospital, and other institutions. So this week, Berman highlights how psychology is very much a structure that is in intimate reliance with the these discursive self-surveillances. So she writes that psychology was and still is the modern discipline par excellence of surveillance, calibration, and control, oriented around a technology of administration or testing that not only classifies and segregates individuals and populations, but also produces forms of being, subjects in its image, a perfect nexus of regulation and confession, end quote. So Berman's article gives several examples of how we can read seemingly small moments or educational encounters as loaded with political intentions of the state and of discourse. So she discusses early projects of schooling and the role of the educator as a very gendered moral intervention for the young child in lower class families to become better aligned with the values of the nation state. So the construction of the teacher as a loving, nurturing woman contributed to this ideal in many ways. So these emotional exchanges with children that Berman highlights created conditions in which children became subjugated into a dominant discourse of who they thought they ought to become, what a family ought to look like, a nuclear working family in the service of the happy dream of self-sufficiency, autonomy, and success. So Berman writes that the school constituted a technology for transforming wild beings into ethical subjects. The success of the strategy would be measured by the transformation of the habits of the urban population from a nomadic mass into a stable, sober, isolated family unit in which the mother formed the focus of domestic management. Thus, although the schoolmaster represented a paradigm of moral excellence and his scholars its reflection, the moral foundation received its exemplification in the habits of domestic management imbued by the good school mistress. So Berman highlights how in the 21st century these social arrangements are still highly visible, and we can see these very much in early childhood education, where women and the composition of the family unit are regulated via child-centered pedagogies. And Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence discuss this concept as well. Schooling was and is a key site of subject formations, where colonialism is able to perpetuate a regulation of bodies in its service through effective knowledge and self-surveillance. So the values of the nation state are cultivated through curricula enacted by teachers and students. So Berman writes of an emotional economy where within the classroom, children monitor themselves against each other, hierarchies that operate via emotional connections that are dependent upon a perception of goodness, that which touches the ordinary and expected notions of who is the good student, who is closest to the image of the child that will secure a future of progress and production, a happy family life, who will be in the service of the values of the current socio-political time. So in this article, she draws on John Clark in articulating that, quote, the socialization of people as the medium or agent of government populates the emerging apparatuses that govern the social. So in early childhood education, we can often hear parents putting their children in childcare for socialization, to prepare for kindergarten, etc. So if these actions are read through Foucauldian theory, we can see how there are much more political ideologies at play in children's socialization via education, much more political and maybe impure than the innocence of preschool or early childhood education. So early childhood education is very much producing subjectivities. It's producing citizens of the nation state, and it governs social and political life through its structures and normative assumptions about who the child is. And this speaks to how pedagogies are inherently political. They're politicizing in that they summon populations as citizens, tutor them in skills and capabilities of citizenship, and as Berman writes, addresses them through languages of empowerment. So something we need to consider is how these theories inform our understanding of the child. Who is the child, and what does this image of the child and of childhood do to pedagogy? Where do these constructions of childhood come from, and what are the discourses that create the child? So next week we'll be reading chapter 3 and asking this very question. That is, who is the child in postmodern or post-structural theory, and what does that do to our understandings of pedagogy? So this week in your virtual collaboratory, you'll be unpacking developmental psychology as an ally of modernist thinking. So we'll be paying specific attention to the following quote by Erica Berman. This was from Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence on page 35. So Berman writes, the emergence of developmental psychology was prompted by concerns to classify, measure, and regulate. In general, developmental psychology is a paradigmatically modern discipline, arising at a time of commitment to narratives of truth, objectivity, science, and reason, end quote. So in your reading of Foucauldian theory this week, how do you see discipline and power operate with developmentalism in early childhood education? So revisit the readings this week and answer this question, have a discussion about this question that's deeply situated in the theoretical perspectives of the readings. So again, as I've said in the past, try not to focus on your own experiences or personal opinions, but rather think with this quote and think with this question based on the readings. So in your provocation this week, you'll be writing 150 to 200 words, 200-word response on this quote. So this one is also from Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence on page 30. So, and it's a quote from that they borrow from Foucault. So Foucault writes that each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth. That is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements. This means the means by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedures accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the state of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. So in 150 or 200 words, share 2 or 3 of the truths that you see are commonly accepted in early childhood education. And then think about what devices or what practices, pedagogies, structures, or maybe pedagogical actions sustain the strength of these truths in the field. So pay attention to something that may be very common in early childhood education, an assumption that you notice in your work about children, about the role of the educator, about the early childhood institution. Find one truth that you have noticed, and then unpack what are the ways of being and what are the practices that allow this truth to remain stable. So I think that's about it for this week, everybody. If you have any questions, please do feel free to email me. And yeah, have a great week.